Hi, Sebastian. How are you?
Hi, Richard. Good to see you again.
Yes, and you. Busy week so far?
Yeah, as always, but
Yeah,
all good.
good. Good. Well, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it. It'd be great if you could kick things off and take us back to where you started in life, where you grew up, went to school, that sort of thing. It'd be great if you could talk our listeners through how you found your way in your early career at, I think it was the German military and Airbus, and eventually how you kind of ended up in the space sector.
Yeah, sure, sure. So I guess it's like with every overnight success story, there's a 10, 20-year story behind it, right? So
Yeah.
I'm 37 now, and when I was 17, so 2 decades ago, pretty much, Spaceship One flew to space in California, and this Spaceship One was designed by Burt Rutan. And I remember how that inspired and fascinated me because I come from a very, very small place in the middle of nowhere, Germany. And for me, space was always very, very far away. So I thought it was something that is pretty much impossible to get into. And when Bert Rutan pulled that off, I was like, okay, I can do that too.
Yeah.
So what I did is I decided that I would have to study aerospace engineering. And you can actually see that in my grades, like from one year to the next, all of a sudden I had like straight A's in math and physics, right? Like I had found my calling pretty much.
Yeah.
And I decided that in order to study aerospace engineering, it would be good for me to join the military in Germany because the German military has a program where, as an officer, you get to study for free and you actually get a salary on top of that. So it's a very attractive package. And I think what the military also teaches you is people skills, right? Like, because in the end, going to space is a team sport. You have to work with very large teams, and you have to be able to lead and make decisions. Um, and so that's what I hope the military would teach me. And so when I was 19, I joined the German infantry. So first in mountain infantry and then in paratroopers, airborne. And then I studied aerospace engineering. I did that in Munich, and my bachelor thesis was already about atmospheric reentry, right? So as you can as you can see, like
Yeah.
I've been in this for a very long time, always motivated to make a real difference in sustainability and accessibility of space, right? Like, because what I always believed was that the one big problem that we have in the space industry is that things are used just for a single time, pretty much, and that
Yeah.
brings the cost up astronomically, right? So if we were able to change that, if we were able to bring back spacecraft, rockets, satellites, and reuse them, then that would bring down the cost of access to space and make it more sustainable at the same time. So it's a good thing to do. And so I did my bachelor's about atmospheric reentry, and then I did my master's at Airbus Defence and Space.
Yeah.
And that was in Munich. Airbus Defence and Space was working on Methalox rocket engines back then. So liquid rocket engines that use methane and liquid oxygen for propulsion. Um, and this is quite interesting because Methalox seems to be the go-to choice of propellants now. I mean, when we look at SpaceX Starship or Blue Origin, New Glenn, Stoke Space Nova first stage. So a lot of new space companies are actually using that propellant combination. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, that was a very interesting topic also for the master thesis. And then I went back to the military and served for another 7 years in the German army, all the way until 2021. I got selected for special operations, served in Afghanistan more than 300 days down there, and then on shorter deployments in Africa as well. And then finally in 2021, we got Atmos started.
Yeah. Amazing. It sounds like you were destined for space. I'm always very, very inspired when I do these shows and speak to great founders like yourself that the kind of the catalyst and the spark for space started so young. For you, 17 years old. I think a lot of people in modern day, some people are just kind of going through life still trying to figure it out now, and
Right.
falling into different careers. So it's always just so inspiring to hear how young the passion started for space. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I did want to ask as well. It's such an interesting skill set going from the military to space. Would you say were there any core skill sets that you feel that you learn in the military that you were able to adapt and deploy in building Atmos and going into building a space company?
Mm. So I would say like three things is maybe most important of what I learned there. I think what the military teaches you very well is that as a leader, you have to be a role model, right?
Yeah,
So in a company, for example, in a startup, you cannot expect your team to work harder than the CEO does, right? So if they see you going home early, they will do the same, right? So gotta be a good role model. Um, then the next thing that the military teaches you very well is ownership, right? Like if there is a problem that needs to be solved, it doesn't matter if it's like a military problem or an engineering problem. If you are the owner of that component, that subsystem, whatever, then you have to own that, right? Like you have to be responsible for it from design to manufacturing to testing to improving it. And it doesn't matter like if your responsibility might end up at some place. You can never say like it's, the supplier's fault or anything like that. It's in the end you have to make it work, and that's something that the military teaches you very well. And then maybe the third part, and that might sound wrong for somebody who's maybe not in the military. When people think about the military, they think about giving orders and orders being followed, right? But
yeah,
especially when you are in special operations in the military, you have very, very experienced people there, right? Like in my unit, I had people that were like 10 or 15 years older than me. They had like 1,000 days plus of experience in Afghanistan. And if I were to just go and say like you do this exactly like I say because I'm the captain here, right? They would have probably, beaten my ass up. So, you got to treat people with respect, and you got to know where your own strengths are and where the strengths of the people in your team are. And I think that's critical for a leader, right? Like you don't need to be the best in everything, but you
yeah.
need to know who is the best for it and give the job to them.
Yeah, absolutely leading from the front. And tell us a bit about Atmos Space. What do you guys do? How do you fit into the space ecosystem, and where do you see you guys going over the next few years?
Yeah. Yeah, so Atmos, I co-founded Atmos together with three co-founders from the space industry, right? So me with my defense background, I'm a little bit exotic there. The other three, they are originally from the space industry. And so the way this started was that in 2017, I met my co-founder and our COO, Marta, at a space conference of the International Space University in Ireland. And I followed her career, and she's done some really, really interesting and amazing things. She worked at NASA, she worked at ESA in strategy. Her last job, she was a launch safety engineer for Ariane 5, the largest European launcher in French Guiana. And by the time I reached out to her to ask her if she wanted to join that company, she was just launching the James Webb Space Telescope to space as a launch safety engineer. So pretty big thing. Like I mean,
Wow.
James Webb was a $10 billion mission, so
Yeah.
really big. And I said pretty much to her like, listen, Marta, this is the climax of your career there, right? Like with Ariane Group. So how about you join this new space startup in Europe, and you become number two, you become our COO, report to nobody except for me. And luckily she agreed, right? So that's how we recruited Marta. And then Jeffrey, our CTO, he was actually introduced by an investor. So that investor saw what we were doing and was already interested. But he also said clearly, like, you are still lacking some talent in one specific area, which is the manufacturing of satellites. And he said, like, I know somebody that you should probably speak to. So he introduced me to Jeff, and Jeff, by that time, had been working for Airbus Defence and Space. So he worked 18 years on the large special satellites. I mean, things like Herschel, the European Hubble telescope, right? Like, or ATV, Jules Verne, the resupply ship for the International Space Station. So, yeah, I reached out to him. We hit it off right away. 2 days later, he was like, okay, I'm in. And then Jeff brought Chris in, our fourth co-founder, because Jeff and Chris, they had met each other when they were working together on Mascot Hayabusa. It's an asteroid lander from JAXA and the German Space Agency. So they pretty much flew to an asteroid like 300 million kilometers away from Earth, took a sample there and brought it back to Earth. It's mind-blowing, right?
Yeah.
And they had got to know each other on that project a couple of years ago already. And that's how we met each other, right? Like, good people bring more good people, right? And now in the meantime, we've grown the company to 50 people, and we're still continuing to grow, always looking for new excellent people to join our team. And what we do at Atmos is we develop technology to return anything from space, and I really mean like anything. Right?
Yeah.
So it could be something as small as an experiment, right? Like for biomedical purposes or for semiconductor manufacturing in space. But it could be also something much larger, like returning a full rocket upper stage from space. And the number one problem that you have with all of those types of payloads is they are flying extremely fast around the Earth, right? Like in low Earth orbit, we're speaking about 25 times the speed of sound. And how do you get rid of all of that kinetic energy? And so what you need for that is heat shields pretty much. And we work on a very, very innovative new heat shield technology, state of the art. We're the first commercial company in Europe to work on these types of inflatable heat shields is what we do. And we are just about to do our first orbital demonstration now.
Nice. Incredible. And I guess in terms of the specific sector around space cargo, transportation, it's such an expansive, interesting industry. What's your thoughts on the current landscape of that part of the sector, and how do you see that evolving, and what kind of role do you see Atmos Space playing in that?
Yeah. So the way that I see it right now when it comes to space transportation is that the market is being dominated by SpaceX, right? So in terms of rocket launches, they have a market share of 80 to 90% now. So what used to be the home turf of Ariane Group with Ariane 4 and 5 is now completely dominated by SpaceX. And the reason why SpaceX is so dominant is because they are the only company that have figured out how to return their rocket stages from space and reuse them, and therefore they have better unit economics. They can just offer the launch much cheaper than everybody else. So if that is the problem, right? Like if that thesis is true, like why does not everybody just copy the SpaceX model, right? Yeah. Well, the answer is because it's freaking hard, right? Like it's technically extremely hard to solve. And I mean, SpaceX has been in business for 20 years now, so it's taken them a long time. So when we look at what's happening in Europe right now, we have now commercial small launchers, maybe like 4 or 5 years of business. They're just about to approach their first flight, and it's still going to take them years to get to reusability, right? And, Ariane Group, unfortunately, with Ariane 6, they decided to go for an expendable launcher again. So that's also putting Ariane Group behind. So it's going to take years to recover that head start that SpaceX has had. That's why I think Atmos is uniquely positioned in that we focus really on that very, very hard aspect of how do I return from space? And we can then partner with other companies to improve their business.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier about that kind of consistent search for great talent and great people to build the business. One of the main motives for starting this podcast is to try and tell the stories of great founders like yourself, your story, how you got into space, to try and make space more accessible. And I agree, and most people do, that space is thriving. I think the economy is going to continue to grow globally, which is fantastic. It's not really getting any easier to find the talent to kind of sustain that growth for the future. So what do you feel we could and should be doing better in terms of like spreading the message at, in the classrooms at grassroots kind of STEM level, to try and make space more relatable, try and make it more accessible for everyone? And I guess this part, it doesn't just appeal to the next generation and just the kids. That's very, very important. But even people now in different industries, I think, in automotive, I don't know about you. I mean, I've only been doing this for 7 years, but still now when I speak to friends and family about space, the immediate perception is astronauts, rocket scientists, astrophysicists, and
Right.
that's it. So yeah,
Right. Yeah. Oh, it's a very good question. I think, um, there's three factors here, right? So on the one side, what Elon Musk and SpaceX have been doing has put space back on the map pretty much, right? Like it used to be a thing that nobody really cared anymore about, a thing of NASA, ESA, very far away from everyday people. And now that there's things like the reusable rockets, there is Starlink that connects everyday people to the internet via space. It is very much on the map again, and especially also when it comes to defense use cases. So I think that despite all the controversies around Elon, this is I won't comment on that right now, huh? But one thing that he has done for the industry is really there's a lot of attention on the space industry right now. So I think that's a good thing. The next thing is that I think it's very important to show to kids and to teenagers and maybe like young grown-ups that are just looking at where am I going in terms of my profession, to show that it is possible to get into the space industry now more than ever, right? So I mean, I'm the best example, right? Like I come from the middle of nowhere, right? Like there's a little bit of agriculture, a little bit of industry where I came from, but it's very far away from space, and I also made it, right? So other people can also make it. And then the third aspect is that I think if we can do things in space or from space that everyday people on Earth can profit from, that is also going to help, right? Like Starlink is one example, right? Like if you get like high-speed internet from space, everybody sees that is good for you. But maybe also in the future we will see things like biomedical research and development in space, like growing maybe, for example, protein crystals in space that can then be used on Earth for example, cancer treatment, right? Like if people see the real applications in their everyday life that are, made possible by space, I think that helps a lot.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I always say this to all, I guess. I think it's that you made the connection there with Starlink and the broadband. I think it's maybe the first step is kind of making space relatable to that younger generation. Right. So like Uber is probably the example. Like most people don't think of Uber as a space company, but they're using data from space. So okay, good. And just I guess on that theme of the young adults and that next generation, and things like social media, seeing, I guess, like the highlight reel, I call it, of successes. It's very rare that people see in this day and age the failures, the lessons learned, and kind of all the hard work, all the sacrifice that goes on behind building a space company and everything else. So what would you say so far has been your biggest lessons that you've learned throughout your career? And on the flip side of that coin, what would you say is your biggest achievement so far?
Yeah, I mean, handling failures is super important, right? Like
Yeah.
you need to be able to really fail and get up again and try again, right? It is actually so important that I can tell you how we do recruiting, for example, at Atmos. We have like, of course, a multi-stage process. So in the first stage, we look at CVs that we get, and we filter out those that are interesting for us. And then when we do interviews, we always do two stages. And actually, the very first stage is an interview with either our COO Marta or with me. And only after that will we do technical interviews, right? And in that first stage, we actually look at, the motivation of the candidate. Of course, also organizational aspects, right? Like, starting date, salary, whatnot. But the most important thing is the motivation, right? Like, does that person really have the drive to overcome failures and go again and work on it as long as it's, until it's really working, right?
Yeah.
And we have had like really, really big problems in the technical development, right? For example, when we started working on the inflatable atmospheric decelerator technology, one of the things that makes our technology special is that we have what's called an air breathing system. So we actually take air from the atmosphere for inflating the inflatable atmospheric decelerator while it's descending through the atmosphere. So what that means is we have to take very, very thin air and compress it and push it into that balloon. And we're talking about air that is still quite hot, right? So initially we started developing a fan from ceramic materials. And anybody who's ever worked with ceramics knows that it's very hard to work with them, right? Like they are by definition brittle, and even if you work with ceramic matrix composites, you still have to piece those parts together, and it's a very tough thing to do. So when we tested our first fan, it pretty much failed very far away from the intended design point, right? And so what we did is we sat together, we started again with a blank sheet of paper, looked at the requirements again, and found a different solution with high temperature metals within just a few months, right? So, and this is something, it could have killed the company, right? Like if you had
Yeah.
just been like, okay, we don't know how to solve this. Let's analyze for half a year and see. Well, maybe we would have run out of money, right? Like as a startup, you have to be very fast, um, yeah, that's just one example, right? There have been numerous other instances where, for example, you work on avionics, you find out that some little PCB is short circuiting, or a harness is not built to your specifications, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a position where you have to get that avionics running to a certain deadline, but the pieces are just not working, or
Yeah.
and you just have to overcome that, and that means that sometimes the avionics guys, they're working at night, they're working on the weekend, on Sunday nights, right? So and that's the type of commitment and of motivation that we are looking for in the people that come to us, right? I always say that as long as the person is smart, you can teach them anything, but they
Yeah.
need to want to be taught, right? So that's the important part. We really need highly motivated people.
Yeah, I guess passion falls into that as well, right? Because those
Yeah,
guys that when those challenges come up, the passion's going to carry you through. When you're in there working
yeah,
all night or you're working on weekends, it's
right,
going to feel like work
right,
unless you love what you do
right,
and motivated to
right.
do. Yeah.
Exactly. You need to love what you do. Absolutely. I always also say that, and also as a founder, I think it's super critical because the amount of hours that you put into the work is crazy, right? Like it's completely not comparable to being employed, and the amount of pain and failures that you have to go through is also crazy, right? Like you fail on a daily basis pretty much, and you really have to love what you do, otherwise you're not going through all of that. So yeah, that's my biggest advice, right? Like find something that you really love and work on that.
Yeah, yeah. My partner's always going crazy at me saying you work too much, you don't have a balance. But for her, she probably thinks I'm super stressed and all this kind of stuff. But to
Yeah,
me, it doesn't really feel like work because I want to do it and I enjoy
exactly.
doing it. So I have more of a sustainable energy to do those longer hours. But yeah, okay,
Exactly. Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
And I guess the final question to wrap things up is kind of a two-part question. The first part is for those for those people that listen to this podcast and want to get inspired to get into the space sector. The first thing is, are there any resources that you identified throughout your journey and getting into space that they can utilize today and they can get access to that will help support them transition in to the space sector? And I guess the second part is if you could distill down all of your wisdom, all of your learnings that you've had throughout your career to one piece of advice, what would it be for those people that want to get into space this year?
That's a very good question, right? Like I am biased, I have to tell you. So if somebody wants to really work in a company like Atmos and you want to work on bringing things back and reusability and sustainability, one resource, like one book that I can recommend to everybody is when you Google for coming home,
Yeah,
reentry and recovery from space. It's a NASA book and it's free online as a PDF. This is awesome, right? Like it covers the whole history from the first Gemini Apollo capsules all the way to the latest technologies in reusable metallic heat shield shingles. It's crazy, and it goes into a lot of level of detail, but it's still like readable also for somebody who's maybe not from the industry. So this is something that I can definitely recommend. Then one institution that I really love is the ISU, the International Space University in Strasbourg. And it's really a university that is focused exclusively on space. And they offer different programs, and one program that I can highly recommend, I did it myself, is the Space Studies program. They do that every year in a different country. I was lucky to do that in 2012 at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, right? And the cool thing is that the ISU draws people from all sorts of different areas, right? So you have, of course, engineers, right? Aerospace, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, but you also have artists, you have people with a medical background, you have architects, you have like really like all sorts of different people. And the only thing that really unites all of them is their passion for space. So if you really want to get like the best network you can get, there's an ISU alumnus in every space agency and every space company in the world. I can promise you that. So yeah, and then final advice from me would be really like find what you really love and then just go for it, right? Like don't let anybody tell you you can't. You can as long as you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I guess that applies to all of those areas that you've just mentioned on the ASU program as well. It doesn't have to be engineering. It can be, artistry, sales, procurement, supply chain, like anything in space. I think there's a space for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Absolutely. Sebastian, thank you so much. Appreciate your time today coming on the podcast. It's been great. And yeah, are you heading out to any of the events this year on the US circuit? I know there's satellite coming up in DC. There's another one in Colorado in, I think, April, and then the small sat in Utah.
Yeah, I will definitely be at the satellite conference in DC, and Colorado. We'll see. That is not confirmed yet, but we're trying to be there as well.
Awesome. Well, hopefully see you soon on the circuit. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thank
Cheers.
you. Bye-bye.